A father with one child is cast out in the cold afternoon rain. Days later, a child's simple drawing forces those who cast them out to bow their heads and earns the respect of the entire city. Before we dive into the story, where are you watching from today? Tell me in the comments below. Now let's get into the story. Julian Vance believed he had mastered the art of the return. He could leave a city for a year, consumed by the voracious appetite of his global tech enterprise, and slide back into its rhythm as if he'd only been gone for the weekend. He could re-enter a boardroom after a long absence and command it within minutes. His presence a low-frequency hum that realigned every moving part to his will. But returning to his own life, he was discovering, was a different physics altogether. The house stood on its familiar manicured lane, a monument of glass and stone he had built for a life that no longer existed. He'd left it in the care of his sister-in-law, Valerie, after his wife Elena's death, entrusting her with the only piece of that life that still drew breath, his daughter, Maya. He pushed open the heavy oak door and was met not with the scent of home, not the ghost of Elena's citrus perfume or the lingering aroma of coffee, but with the sterile, astringent bite of industrial-strength cleaner. The air was cold, still like a showroom. Nothing was out of place. Not a magazine on the polished granite island. Not a shoe by the door. Not a single fingerprint on the gleaming steel of the refrigerator. It was perfect. It was wrong. He stood there for a moment, the handle of his suitcase growing heavy in his hand, a sense of profound dislocation washing over him. This was the house where Maya had taken her first steps, where Elena had planted a lemon tree that she swore would one day yield the best lemons in the state. He remembered the chaos, the life, the comfortable clutter of toys and books and half-finished projects. Now the silence was so absolute it seemed to have weight, pressing in on him. He felt like a trespasser in his own past, a ghost walking through a meticulously curated museum exhibit of a life he was supposed to be living. Every surface reflected a distorted version of himself, a man who had run from his own grief and outsourced the raising of his child. The guilt, a familiar companion he had kept at bay with 1,000-hour work weeks and transcontinental flights, landed squarely in his chest. "Julian, you're here." Valerie's voice, bright and brittle, shattered the silence. She emerged from the living room, wiping her hands on a crisp apron, her smile as immaculate as the rest of the house. She was Elena's sister, but where Elena had been soft curves and easy laughter, Valerie was all sharp angles and disciplined posture. "Valerie," he said, forcing a smile that felt foreign on his face. "The place looks spotless." "Well, someone has to maintain standards," she said, a hint of martyrdom in her tone. "You know how I believe a clean home is a clear mind. Maya, darling, come say hello to your father." A small figure appeared in the arched doorway of the living room. Maya. She was 7 now, but seemed smaller, as if she were trying to take up as little space as possible. Her dark, curly hair, so like Elena's, was pulled back in a severe, tight braid. Her dress was pristine white, without a single smudge. She did not run to him. She did not smile. She stood with her hands clasped behind her back, her eyes fixed on the polished floorboards somewhere to the left of his expensive shoes. "Hello, Maya," Julian said softly, his voice thick with an emotion he couldn't name. She gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. "Hello, Father." Father, not Daddy. The word was a punch to the gut. He knelt down, trying to meet her gaze, but she flinched, her eyes darting towards Valerie for a fraction of a second before returning to the floor. As he got closer, he saw it. On the delicate skin of her left wrist, just peeking out from the cuff of her dress, was a patch of raw, red skin. It wasn't a simple scrape. It had a strange, almost uniform pattern of abrasions, like it had been scrubbed with something coarse. He gently reached for her hand. "What happened here, sweetie?" Maya snatched her hand back as if his touch were a hot coal, hiding it behind her back. Valerie stepped forward, her smile unwavering, a mask of placid concern. "Oh, that silly thing," she said with a light laugh. "She took a tumble on the playground yesterday. You know, Maya, always so clumsy. I put some cream on it. She barely even noticed it. Julian looked from Valerie's placid face to Maya's terrified stillness. A lie? He didn't know how he knew, but the certainty of it was as solid and cold as the granite countertops in the kitchen. It was a plausible lie, a perfect explanation, but it hung in the sterile air between them, shimmering with falsehood. In that instant, his homecoming was over. His investigation had begun. The silence of the house was no longer just empty. It was filled with unspoken things, and the clean, polished surfaces seemed to be hiding a universe of dirt just beneath. The first 24 hours in the house were a masterclass in performance art, with Valerie as the star and Julian as the unwilling audience. She played the part of the devoted, sacrificing guardian with unnerving precision. The home wasn't just clean, it was a fortress of order. Every object had its designated place, every hour its designated purpose. Julian watched, his stoicism a carefully constructed dam holding back a flood of unease. He had returned to reconnect with his daughter, but he found himself separated from her by an invisible wall of rules and rituals, all enforced by Valerie's bright, unblinking smile. That evening, she prepared a meal that could have been photographed for a health magazine. Grilled chicken, steamed asparagus, and a mound of quinoa. It was nutritionally perfect and utterly joyless. They sat at the vast dining table, the three of them so far apart they might as well have been in separate rooms. The clinking of silverware against porcelain was the only sound. Julian tried to start a conversation, asking Maya about school, but Valerie answered for her. She's doing wonderfully. A very quiet, obedient student, her teacher says. We've been working on her penmanship. Julian watched Maya. She ate with a rigid, fearful precision, her back ramrod straight. She held her fork in a tight grip, cutting her chicken into minuscule squares. Her focus was absolute, as if she were defusing a bomb. When a single grain of quinoa fell from her fork onto the pristine white tablecloth, she froze. Her eyes, wide with panic, flickered to Valerie. Julian saw the terror in that small glance, and it was wholly out of proportion to the minor offense. Valerie's smile didn't falter, but her voice dropped a degree. Accidents happen, Maya. We just have to be more careful, don't we? We must clean up our own messes. The words were simple, but they landed in the silent room with the weight of a threat. Maya quickly, silently, picked up the single grain with her fingers and placed it on the side of her plate, her head bowed in shame. Julian's own food tasted like ash in his mouth. The tension was a physical presence at the table, a fourth guest, cold and menacing. He felt a primal urge to sweep Maya up and run from the house, but he knew he couldn't. He had no proof, only a gut feeling, a father's intuition that had been dormant for too long and was now screaming at him. To act rashly would be to lose. Valerie had created a perfect alibi of care, and he was the absentee father. Who would believe him? Later, he found a moment when Valerie was on the phone in her study. He went to Maya's room, knocking softly. It was as sterile as the rest of the house. Her bed was made with military precision. Her books were arranged by height on a shelf, and a single, worn-looking teddy bear sat on her pillow, its fur matted in places. It was the only object in the room that seemed to have been loved. He remembered buying it for her at a hospital gift shop the day she was born. "Can I come in?" he asked. She was on the floor, a single sheet of paper and a crayon in front of her, but she wasn't drawing, just holding the crayon. She nodded. He sat on the edge of her bed, the silence stretching between them. He wanted to ask her 1,000 questions. Are you happy? Is she hurting you? What happened to your wrist? But he knew the words would die in the air, intercepted by her fear. Instead, he just sat there, a silent offering of presence. The memory hit him then, unbidden and sharp with pain. Maya, age 5. Elena, alive and radiant. Their old backyard, not this manicured prison. They were having a finger-painting party. Elena had laid out a huge canvas, and Maya was a whirlwind of color, shrieking with laughter as she smeared blue and yellow paint across her own face, her hands, her clothes. Elena had looked at Julian, her eyes sparkling. "Look at our beautiful little mess," she'd said. her voice full of love. He'd taken a picture he kept in his wallet. Maya, covered in paint, grinning a gap-toothed smile, the very picture of uninhibited, joyful childhood. The contrast between that vibrant, messy, happy child and the silent, contained, fearful girl sitting before him was a physical blow. It was the truest measure of what had been lost. It was his fault. He had let the light go out of his daughter's eyes because he couldn't bear to look at her, to see Elena's reflection and be reminded of his own failure to be there when she'd needed him most. "I'm sorry I was gone so long," he whispered, the words inadequate. Maya didn't look up, but her small hand, the one without the mark, crept across the floor and rested for a second on his knee. Then the sound of footsteps in the hall. The hand vanished. Maya went rigid. Valerie appeared in the doorway, her smile back in place. "Everything all right in here? It's almost time for her bath. We have a schedule to keep." The invisible wall was back up. Julian stood, the phantom touch of his daughter's hand burning on his knee. He had to be smarter. He had to be more patient. He was a stranger here, an intruder in the rigid, twisted world Valerie had built. To save his daughter, he would have to learn its rules, find its weaknesses, and tear it down from the inside. Julian knew he couldn't breach Valerie's fortress alone. He needed an ally, someone outside the cold, polished walls of the house who might have seen the cracks in the facade. His mind immediately went to Mrs. Gable, the elderly woman who had lived next door since before Julian had even bought the property. She was a fixture of the neighborhood, a gentle, observant woman who spent most of her days tending her roses and watching the world go by from her porch. Elena had been fond of her, often bringing her cups of tea and listening to her stories. The next afternoon, under the pretense of needing some fresh air to clear his head from jet lag, Julian went for a walk. He timed it perfectly, seeing Mrs. Gable snipping deadheads from a vibrant rose bush that bordered their properties. "Mrs. Gable," he called out, his voice friendly, casual. "Those roses are as beautiful as ever." She looked up, her kind, wrinkled face breaking into a genuine smile. "Julian, so good to see you home. We've missed a man's presence around this place." Then, the smile faltered slightly, her eyes flicking towards the house. "It's been quiet." The word hung in the air, laden with meaning. It was the same word he had used. Quiet. "It has been," Julian agreed, leaning against the fence. "Valerie keeps a very orderly house." He watched her carefully, her hands, holding the shears, stilled. She avoided his gaze, focusing intently on a ladybug crawling up a leaf. "Yes, orderly. Very clean." There it was again, the subtext. He knew he had to tread carefully. Valerie had likely intimidated the old woman into silence. "I've been gone a long time," he said, his voice dropping slightly. "Maya seems so different. Quieter." Mrs. Gable took a deep, shaky breath. She glanced around, as if expecting Valerie to materialize from the hedges. "Children change, Julian," she said, her voice barely a whisper. But her eyes told a different story. They were filled with a pained, helpless worry. "Please, Eleanor," he said, using her first name as Elena always had. "I need to know. I have this feeling that something is wrong. You see more from your window than anyone." Tears welled in the corners of her eyes. She put down her shears and wrung her small, gloved hands. "I don't hear her laugh anymore," she whispered, the words rushing out as if a dam had broken. "After Elena passed for a while, I'd hear her playing in the yard, crying sometimes, like a normal grieving child. But for the last year, nothing. Just silence. Sometimes at night I hear things. Strange things." "What things?" Julian pressed, his heart pounding. "Scrubbing," she said, her brow furrowed in confusion. "A harsh, repetitive scrubbing sound from the upstairs bathroom, sometimes late at night. And I see Maya in the yard, but she's not playing. She just stands there, staring, like a little soldier. It's not right, Julian. A child should make noise. A child should make a mess. The word scrubbing sent a chill down Julian's spine. It connected to something, a fragmented piece of the puzzle he couldn't yet place. He thanked Mrs. Gable, promising her he would handle it, that she didn't need to worry. As he walked back to the house, her words echoed in his mind. A child should make a mess. Later that day, Valerie was occupied with a lengthy call to one of her charity committees. A call Julian had overheard her planning. It was his chance. He went to Maya's room, feigning a need to put away some of his own things that had been stored there. He started tidying up, a task that was absurd in the already immaculate room. He moved books, straightened the already straight teddy bear. He was looking for something, anything, a message in a bottle from his stranded daughter. As he ran a hand under the mattress, his fingers brushed against a piece of paper. He pulled it out. It was a child's drawing, done in a single dark brown crayon. The perspective was skewed, the figures rudimentary, but the meaning was terrifyingly clear. A small, stick-like figure with a wild scribble of dark hair was on its hands and knees, holding an object over a spot on the floor. The object was a brush, drawn with angry, viciously pressed lines, its bristles like sharp teeth. Standing over the small figure was a tall, slender shape, drawn as a solid block of darkness, with no face, no hands, just an overwhelming, menacing presence. He stared at the drawing, his blood running cold. Scrubbing. The word from Mrs. Gable slammed into place. The angry brush, the dark, looming shape. This wasn't a drawing of a chore. This was a drawing of a punishment. This was a depiction of terror. He quickly folded the paper and slipped it into his pocket just as he heard Valerie's footsteps approaching. He met her in the hallway, his face a mask of neutrality. He needed to test her, to see her reaction. "I was just on the phone with my office," he lied smoothly. "They were asking for a recommendation for a local charity to support. You're on the board of that children's foundation, aren't you?" Valerie preened. "Why, yes. We do wonderful work for underprivileged youth." "That's great," Julian said. "I also ran into Mrs. Gable outside. She said to say hello." The change was instantaneous. The charitable glow vanished from Valerie's face, replaced by a tight, pinched annoyance. "That woman," she scoffed. "Honestly, she has nothing better to do than spy on people all day. I wish she would mind her own business. Nosy old gossip." Her reaction was too sharp, too defensive. It was the reaction of someone with something to hide. Julian nodded calmly, but inside, a cold, hard certainty was forming. He had the witness. He had the evidence scribbled in brown crayon. And he had an enemy who was hiding in plain sight, polishing the floors of his house while she systematically tried to scrub the very life out of his daughter. The child's drawing in his pocket felt like a shard of ice against his skin. It was a map, and Julian knew it led to the heart of Valerie's cruelty. The angry brush. It wasn't just a symbol. It had to be a real object. He had to find it. He needed tangible proof, something more concrete than an old woman's fears and a child's cryptic art. He needed the weapon. The opportunity came 2 days later. Julian, playing the part of the grateful brother-in-law, announced he had booked a full spa day for Valerie at the most exclusive hotel in the city. Thank you," he'd said, "for everything you've done. You deserve a day to yourself. I insist." Her first reaction was suspicion. Her eyes narrowed, searching his for any sign of an ulterior motive. But Julian's face was a placid mask of generosity. The lure of the luxurious pampering, and perhaps the opportunity to tell her friends about her wealthy brother-in-law's largesse, was too strong to resist. She accepted, her pleasure warring with her innate distrust. The moment her car pulled out of the driveway, the clock started ticking. He had maybe 4 hours. He told Maya they were going to play a game of hide-and-seek, a gentle ruse to keep her occupied and allow him to move through the house. He was the seeker. He started his search methodically, like a soldier clearing a building. He began with the obvious places, the cleaning closets in the laundry room and the pantry. They were filled with the expected bottles and sprays, all neatly arranged, but the brushes were standard household items, soft-bristled and well-used. Nothing matched the vicious energy of the drawing. This wasn't about general cleaning. This was personal, ritualistic. His mind churned, connecting Valerie's obsession with perfection to Mrs. Gable's account of scrubbing sounds from the upstairs bathroom. Not the guest bath. Not Maya's bath. It had to be her space. Her sanctuary of order. He went to Valerie's master suite. The air inside was different, colder, and held the faint, cloying scent of potpourri trying to mask the ever-present odor of bleach. It was as impersonal as a hotel room. He felt a profound sense of violation stepping into her private domain, but the image of Maya's fearful eyes pushed him forward. He checked under the bed, in the closet, behind the dressers. Nothing. He moved to the ensuite bathroom. It was a study in white marble and chrome, every surface gleaming. On the vanity sat a perfect row of expensive lotions and perfumes. He opened the medicine cabinet. More meticulously arranged products. Then he looked under the sink. Behind a stack of fluffy, folded white towels, he saw a plain wooden box. It was out of place, simple and unadorned amidst the luxury. His heart began to hammer against his ribs. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a black cloth, was a set of 3 brushes. They were not for cleaning floors. They were industrial-grade detailing brushes, the kind used for scrubbing engine blocks or grout lines. The bristles were made of stiff, unforgiving nylon, sharp to the touch. One of them, the largest, had a few tiny, dark, curly hairs tangled in its bristles. Maya's hair. Beside the brushes was a large, unlabeled bottle filled with a clear, viscous liquid. He unscrewed the cap and sniffed. The harsh, chemical smell was overwhelming. It was the smell of the house, but concentrated, weaponized. This wasn't a household cleaner. This was something caustic. The pieces slammed together in his mind with the force of a physical blow. The drawing. The red, patterned abrasion on Maya's wrist. Mrs. Gable's story. The scrubbing wasn't for the floors. The bad spots weren't on the tile. The punishment for being imperfect, for spilling a grain of rice, for being a clumsy child, was to be forced to scrub herself, probably with this harsh chemical, until she was raw. Valerie wasn't just cleaning the house. She was trying to scrub away Maya's very essence, her childhood, her resemblance to the messy, beloved Elena. A wave of pure, white-hot rage washed over Julian. It was so intense it made him dizzy. His hands clenched into fists, his knuckles white. The primal, animal urge to smash, to destroy, to find Valerie, and he shut his eyes, forcing the red haze from his vision. He was a strategist. He was a builder of empires. He did not operate on rage. Rage was a blunt instrument. Justice required a scalpel. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his entire body trembling with the effort of control. He took out his phone and, his hands shaking slightly, he photographed the contents of the box from every angle. The brushes, the hairs, the bottle. Then, with painstaking precision, he put everything back exactly as he had found it. The towels, the box, the lid. He closed the cabinet door, wiped his fingerprints from the chrome handle, and backed out of the room. He had the weapon. He had the proof. And now he had to endure. He had to sit at the dinner table with this monster, smile, and wait for the perfect moment to dismantle her world, piece by piece. The soldier's patience had begun. Now he was operating behind enemy lines. Every moment in the house was a tightrope walk over a chasm of his own fury. He had to be the concerned brother-in-law, the distant but caring father, while every instinct screamed at him to grab Maya and flee. But he knew that Valerie, cornered, would be dangerous. She would paint him as unstable, an absentee parent trying to violently reclaim a child he had abandoned. The system, with its love of procedure and its suspicion of sudden changes, might even side with her. He needed more than just the physical evidence. He needed to understand the why. He needed leverage. His first call was to Marcus Thorne, a man whose name did not appear in any public directory. Marcus was an ex-federal agent who now ran a highly discreet private security and intelligence firm for a handful of elite clients. He was a ghost, a finder of secrets, a man who could navigate the labyrinth of sealed records and buried histories. Julian. Marcus's voice was calm, professional. It's been a while. I trust your project in Singapore was successful. It was, Julian said, his own voice low, standing in the far corner of the garden to avoid being overheard. I have a new project for you, Marcus. Domestic. I need a complete workup on one Valerie Prescott. My sister-in-law. There was a brief pause. Prescott. As in Elena's sister. The same, Julian confirmed. I want everything. Sealed juvenile records, financials, school history, any medical incidents. I want to know what makes her tick. And Marcus, this is the most important job you've ever done for me. Be invisible. Understood, Marcus said. I'll be in touch. With the wheels of intelligence gathering in motion, Julian had to turn his attention back to the immediate battlefield. His own home. That evening, Valerie returned from her spa day, glowing and self-satisfied. She suggested they all watch a movie together. A family activity, Julian agreed, his stomach twisting into a knot. They sat on the enormous white sofa in the media room. Julian on one end, Valerie on the other, and Maya in the middle, a tiny, silent buffer zone. The movie was a brightly colored animated feature, full of talking animals and cheerful songs. But the air in the room was thick with unspoken tension. Julian was hyper-aware of every movement. He saw the way Valerie's hand rested on Maya's shoulder, her fingers gripping just a little too tightly. He heard the quiet hiss in her voice when she told Maya to sit up straight. You'll wrinkle your dress. He watched Maya, who stared at the screen with wide, unseeing eyes, her body held in a state of rigid preparedness, as if expecting a blow at any moment. Julian's mind was a storm. He mentally rehearsed his plan, catalogued his evidence, and fought the overwhelming urge to simply end it, to confront Valerie right there. But he held himself in check, his face a mask of placid interest in the cartoon antics on screen. This forced proximity, this act of feigned normalcy, was the most difficult thing he had ever done. It was a form of torture, and his only comfort was the knowledge that it was for a purpose. Later that night, long after Valerie had gone to bed, Julian couldn't sleep. He walked past Maya's room and saw a sliver of light from under the door. He pushed it open gently. She was sitting up in bed, clutching the old, matted teddy bear to her chest, her face pale in the dim light of her nightlight. She wasn't crying. She was just staring at the wall. He didn't say a word. He walked over and sat on the edge of her bed. For a long time, they just sat in the quiet, shared space. He wasn't a father trying to extract a confession. He was just a presence, a solid, unmoving object in her world of fear and uncertainty. He wanted her to know she wasn't alone in the dark. Slowly, tentatively, he reached out and took her small, cold hand. She didn't pull away this time. Her fingers were stiff at first, then relaxed slightly in his grasp. He could feel the faint, frantic pulse in her delicate wrist. They sat like that for what felt like an eternity, the only sound the quiet hum of the house. Then she spoke. Her voice was a bare whisper, so faint he thought he might have imagined it. It was not directed at him, but at the empty space in front of her, a secret, finally given voice. The bad spots, she whispered. They don't come out. The words struck him with the force of a physical blow. It was a direct confirmation of his most horrific theory. The bad spots weren't on the floor or her clothes. They were on her, in her. It was the twisted gospel according to Valerie. The idea that Maya herself was inherently dirty, flawed, and needed to be scrubbed clean. He squeezed her hand gently, a silent promise that he understood. He would get the spots out. He would wash away the fear and the pain, not with a brush, but with a father's love. The soldier now had his mission brief, straight from the source. The waiting was almost over. The encrypted file from Marcus arrived 3 days later. It was a thin file, but its contents were dense with a hidden history of pain. Julian sat in his car, parked in a secluded spot overlooking the city, and read the report on his tablet. The screen's glow illuminated a story that made the breath catch in his throat. Valerie and Elena Prescott were not raised in the idyllic suburban home their family had projected. Their mother was a woman afflicted with a severe, undiagnosed obsessive-compulsive disorder, fixated on cleanliness and perfection. But her pathology had a focus: Valerie. Elena, the beautiful, sunny, effortlessly charming child, was the favored one, the clean one. Valerie, who was quieter, more awkward, and suffered from childhood eczema, was deemed dirty. She became the target of her mother's brutal purification rituals. The report detailed them in cold, procedural language: forced multi-hour baths in scalding water, scrubbing with harsh lye soap, punishments for any perceived messiness that ranged from withholding food to being locked in a sterile white bathroom for hours. The scrubbing sounds Mrs. Gable heard were an echo from the past. The report included a sealed juvenile medical file Marcus had managed to unearth. At age 9, Valerie was hospitalized for 2 weeks with second-degree chemical burns on her arms and back. The official story was a household accident involving cleaning supplies. The doctor's private notes, which Marcus had somehow acquired, expressed deep suspicion of abuse. But the family closed ranks, the investigation was dropped, and the records were sealed when she turned 18. Julian leaned his head back against the leather seat, the tablet heavy in his lap. This wasn't an excuse for Valerie's cruelty, but it was an explanation. It was a map of her brokenness. She wasn't just a monster. She was a monster that had been made, forged in a crucible of trauma. And now, she was reenacting that trauma on the person who represented everything she could never be: Elena's daughter. Maya, with her dark, curly hair and her father's wealth, was a living embodiment of the sister Valerie had both loved and pathologically resented. The jealousy, the projection, the obsessive need for control. It all clicked into place. The knowledge didn't soften his resolve. It hardened it into something sharp and precise. He now understood his enemy completely. As he processed this, his mind flashed back to the day of Elena's accident. He'd been in Tokyo, closing a deal he'd convinced himself was the most important thing in the world. He'd ignored her call, telling himself he'd phone her back as soon as the meeting was over. The next call was from the hospital. His failure wasn't just being absent. It was a fundamental miscalculation of what was important. He had chosen the boardroom over his wife, and in the aftermath, he had chosen his work over his daughter. He had left Maya in the care of this broken woman because it was easier than facing his own grief and his own culpability. He would not make that mistake again. That evening, the final piece of the puzzle fell into place, not through investigation, but through Valerie's own loss of control. Julian's presence in the house, his quiet observation, his gentle re-engagement with Maya. It was all applying a steady, unbearable pressure to the cracks in Valerie's composure. At dinner, Maya, perhaps feeling a sliver of confidence from her father's presence, reached for the water pitcher. Her small hands fumbled, and the pitcher tipped, sending a cascade of ice water across the white tablecloth. It was just spilled water. But to Valerie, it was a catastrophic failure of order. Her mask didn't just slip, it disintegrated. She shot up from her chair, her face contorted with a rage that was terrifying in its purity. She grabbed Maya's arm, her fingers digging into the child's thin bicep. "You are a filthy, clumsy girl," she hissed, her voice a low, venomous whisper that was louder than a shout. "You are disgusting, just like her." The last word was spat out with a lifetime of resentment. Elena. Time seemed to slow down. Julian was on his feet in an instant. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. The cold fury radiating from him was enough to make Valerie flinch. "Let her go, Valerie," he said, his voice like chips of ice. She looked at him, and for a single horrifying second, he saw the truth in her eyes. There was no civility, no pretense of care. There was only a deep, bottomless well of hatred. She had finally made a mistake in front of him, a direct, undeniable act of aggression. It was the last piece of evidence he needed. He had the means, the motive, and now he had the act. The time for patience was over. The time for the reckoning had come. The plan had to be executed with the precision of a surgical strike. A direct, private confrontation would allow Valerie to deny, to lie, to twist the narrative. Julian needed a witness, but not just any witness. He needed someone whose moral authority Valerie herself had spent a year cultivating, someone she could not easily dismiss or discredit. He called Reverend Michael, the pastor of the local church where Valerie was a prominent member of the fundraising committee. She frequently spoke of him, basking in his praise for her charitable spirit and unwavering devotion. Julian invited the pastor to the house for tea, framing it as a desire to discuss a substantial donation to the church's youth outreach program, a cause he knew both Valerie and the pastor were passionate about. It was the perfect bait. Valerie was thrilled, preening at the thought of showing off her perfect home and her wealthy, influential brother-in-law to her pastor. She spent the entire morning in a flurry of activity, ensuring every surface shone, every cushion was plumped. When Reverend Michael arrived, a kind-faced man in his late 50s, Valerie greeted him with effusive warmth. They settled in the formal living room, a space so immaculate it felt like no one had ever lived in it. Maya was brought in to say a polite hello, a small, perfect doll in a starched dress, before being dismissed to her room. Julian let Valerie lead the conversation for a few minutes, allowing her to bask in the pastor's praise for her selfless work. Then, he calmly, deliberately, made his move. "Reverend," he began, his voice even. "Speaking of the youth, I was so impressed seeing how Valerie has nurtured Maya's artistic side. She's becoming quite the little artist." Valerie beamed, caught in the trap. "Oh yes, she's a very creative child." Julian reached into the inner pocket of his jacket. "She made this the other day. I was hoping you could help me understand it. Your work with children gives you such insight." He unfolded the brown crayon drawing and placed it on the polished glass of the coffee table. The small, scrubbing figure, the giant, angry brush, the looming, featureless shadow. The air in the room changed. The temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Reverend Michael leaned forward, his brow furrowed in confusion as he studied the crude, violent image. Valerie froze. The smile was gone, her face a pale, taut mask. Julian could see the frantic calculations behind her eyes as she tried to formulate a response. He didn't give her the chance. He looked directly at her, his voice still quiet, but now laced with steel. "It reminds me of a story Elena once told me, a long time ago, about her childhood, about a little girl, and some very harsh soaps, and spots that wouldn't come out. That was it, the key. The mention of her own buried trauma, a secret she thought was locked away forever. Something inside Valerie shattered. The carefully constructed dam of a lifetime of repression burst, and a torrent of pure, undiluted poison flooded out. "She's a liar!" Valerie shrieked, leaping to her feet, her voice high and hysterical. Her eyes were wild, fixed on Julian. "She's a dirty, ungrateful child who needs to be taught a lesson. She's messy and imperfect, and she needed to be made clean. I did it for her, to make her better. She's just like her mother. So perfect, so easy. Everyone always loved her more." The tirade went on, a stream of consciousness confession of jealousy, resentment, and madness. She was no longer speaking to Julian or the pastor. She was screaming at ghosts from her past. The performance was over. The perfect facade had crumbled to dust, revealing the twisted, screaming ruin beneath. Reverend Michael stared, his face a mixture of horror and profound pity. He had seen the truth. In the midst of the chaos, a small movement caught Julian's eye. Maya, drawn out of her room by the shouting, was standing in the doorway, her small frame trembling. She had seen it. She had seen the monster lose control, had seen its power break. Valerie, lost in her rage, didn't notice her, but Julian did. He held out his hand. For a moment, Maya hesitated. Then, with a resolve that seemed to come from a deep, hidden wellspring of courage, she walked across the room. She didn't run. She walked past the screaming woman who had terrorized her. She walked directly to Julian, took his outstretched hand, and held on tight. She didn't look at Valerie. She looked up at her father, her eyes clear for the first time. In her small, silent act of defiance, she had chosen her side. The power in the house had shifted, completely and irrevocably. The rescue had begun. The sound of Valerie's frantic, unraveling monologue was still echoing in the pristine living room when Reverend Michael, his face pale and set with grim determination, pulled out his cell phone. He didn't need to be prompted. He had been a pastor for 30 years. He had seen the face of human suffering, and he recognized the look of a tormented soul in Maya's eyes and the sound of madness in Valerie's voice. Julian had briefed him that there was a sensitive family matter, and that his presence as a calm authority might be needed. He had not been prepared for this. His call was brief, his voice low but firm, conveying the urgency of the situation to the dispatcher on the other end. Within 15 minutes, the quiet, manicured street was alive with the silent, flashing lights of 2 patrol cars and an unmarked sedan. A uniformed officer, a woman with a calm, no-nonsense demeanor, and a plain-clothed man who introduced himself as an agent from Child Protective Services were met at the door by Julian. The arrival of authority had a sobering effect on Valerie. Her hysteria had collapsed into a sullen, resentful silence. She sat on the white sofa, surrounded by the wreckage of her perfect world, refusing to speak or make eye contact. The intervention was methodical, professional, and blessedly quiet. Julian, speaking in calm, measured tones, walked the CPS agent, Mr. Davies, through the timeline. He presented the evidence he had gathered, the photograph of the industrial brushes on his phone, a printed copy of the key findings from Marcus's report on Valerie's past, and the drawing. He laid Maya's brown crayon testimony on the table, and it seemed to suck all the air out of the room. While the police officers spoke with Valerie, who remained mute, Mr. Davies asked to see the bathroom. Julian led him upstairs to the master suite. The uniformed officer followed. Under the sink, behind the fluffy white towels, the wooden box was exactly where Julian had left it. The officer put on a pair of gloves and opened it. The brushes, the unlabeled bottle, the single, dark hair caught in the bristles. It was all there. At that moment, a new voice joined the quiet proceedings. Mrs. Gable, seeing the official cars and sensing a shift in the balance of power, had walked across her lawn, her face a mask of anxious courage. "I need to speak to whoever is in charge," she said, her voice trembling but firm. She stood in Julian's entryway and, with the quiet dignity of a witness whose time has finally come, she told them everything. She spoke of the year of silence, the absence of a child's laughter that was like a constant, low-grade alarm. She described the strange, harsh scrubbing sounds at all hours of the night. She talked about seeing Maya standing alone in the yard, unnaturally still, for hours on end. Her testimony was not dramatic or accusatory. It was a simple, heartbreaking chronicle of observed details, and its power was devastating. Corroborated everything. Mr. Davies then knelt down to speak with Maya, who had been clinging to Julian's leg throughout the ordeal. His voice was gentle. He didn't ask her what had happened. He asked her simple, safe questions. He asked about her teddy bear. He asked her what her favorite color was. Then, he asked the most important question of all. "Who do you feel safest with, Maya?" Maya didn't speak. She just tightened her grip on Julian's trousers and pointed a small, certain finger at her father. It was enough. The cascade of truth was complete. A female officer gently approached Valerie. "Ma'am, you'll need to come with us." Valerie was escorted from the house. She didn't struggle or speak. The mask of the perfect hostess, the pious charity worker, the devoted guardian, was gone. All that was left was a hollowed-out woman, her face a blank slate of stone. As she was led to the patrol car, she passed the lemon tree Elena had planted in the front yard. For a fleeting moment, her stony expression crumpled, a flicker of some deep, unreadable emotion crossing her face before it was gone. Then she was in the car, and the door was closed, and the flashing lights pulled away, leaving the street in an unnerving, profound silence. The legal machinery, once set in motion, moved with surprising speed. With the physical evidence, Mrs. Gable's eyewitness account, the pastor's testimony, and Valerie's self-incriminating outburst, the case was airtight. The CPS agent, Mr. Davies, granted Julian emergency temporary custody on the spot. The house, once a symbol of his success, now felt like a crime scene, every polished surface tainted. He knew they couldn't stay there another night. He packed a single bag for Maya, mostly grabbing clothes at random. When he picked up the worn teddy bear from her pillow, she reached out for it, her first voluntary gesture since the authorities had arrived. He handed it to her, and she hugged it to her chest like a shield. He knelt in front of her. "We're going to leave now, Maya. We won't be coming back here for a while." She just nodded, her eyes wide. He lifted her into his arms. She was so light, a fragile weight against his chest. As he carried her through the living room and out the front door, he didn't look back. He was carrying his daughter out of her prison, and he felt a surge of profound relief so intense it was almost painful. This was his new mission, and it started now. They checked into a suite at a 5-star hotel downtown. It was a space with no history, no ghosts in the hallways, no lingering scent of bleach. It was a clean slate. The suite had a panoramic view of the city lights, a glittering tapestry that seemed a world away from the cold, dark house they had just left. Julian, unsure of what a rescued child needed, ordered room service. He ordered everything he could think of: pizza with extra cheese, a mountain of French fries, a hot fudge sundae with 3 cherries, a plate of chocolate chip cookies. It was a feast of forbidden, messy, joyful things. When the cart arrived, Maya stared at it, her eyes wide with a mixture of fear and wonder. She looked at Julian as if for permission. "It's all for you," he said gently. "You can eat whatever you want. You can even eat with your hands." She hesitated, then slowly, she picked up a slice of pizza. She held it awkwardly for a moment, then took a small, tentative bite. A little bit of sauce smeared on her cheek. She froze, her hand flying up to wipe it away, her eyes darting around the room as if expecting a reprimand. Julian reached out, not with a napkin, but with his finger, and gently wiped the sauce away. He smiled. "It's okay, sweetie. It's just pizza." She watched him for a long moment, then took another bite and then another. She ate 2 full slices, a small, quiet act of rebellion and reclamation. That night, in the strange, luxurious bed, the trauma surfaced. He was dozing in a chair beside her bed when the first scream tore through the silence of the suite. He was by her side in an instant. She was thrashing in her sleep, her face contorted in terror, muttering about spots and the brush. He gathered her into his arms, holding her trembling body against his. "Sure, you're safe," he whispered over and over. "Daddy's here. You're safe now. The spots are all gone." He held her until the trembling subsided and she fell back into a deep, exhausted sleep, her small hand clutching the front of his shirt. He didn't put her back in her bed. He carried her to the large armchair by the window and sat there for the rest of the night, holding his daughter as she slept. The city lights blurred through his tired eyes. He looked down at her peaceful face, the faint tear tracks still visible on her cheeks, and a wave of emotion washed over him: fear, love, and a crushing sense of responsibility. He was terrified. He had no idea how to be a full-time father, how to heal these wounds he couldn't even see. He had built an empire from nothing, commanded boardrooms, and negotiated billion-dollar deals, but all of that felt like child's play compared to this. The weight of her small body in his arms was heavier and more important than anything he had ever held. He had failed her once by being absent. He made a silent vow to her, to Elena, to himself, in the quiet of that hotel room. He would not fail her again. This was his purpose now. Not in the distant glow of a laptop screen, but here, in the dark, holding his daughter, keeping the nightmares at bay. The seasons turned. A year passed, a quiet, deliberate passage of time measured not by fiscal quarters and market reports, but by small, momentous victories. The first time Maya laughed out loud, a startling, beautiful sound like bells, while watching a cartoon. The first time she finger-painted, and instead of freezing, She giggled as she smeared blue paint on his nose. The first time she argued with him about bedtime. Each was a milestone, a small stone laid on the path leading her out of the dark woods of her past. The big, sterile house was sold. Julian couldn't bear to step inside it again, so he had a service pack everything, instructing them to discard anything belonging to Valerie and to save only the things that were clearly Elena's or Maya's. They moved into a new house, one they chose together. It was smaller, warmer, with a big, rambling garden and a sun-drenched room that they turned into an art studio. It was a house built for living in, not for being looked at. Soon, it was filled with the comfortable clutter of a happy home. Maya's drawings taped to the refrigerator, a half-finished puzzle on the coffee table, muddy boots by the back door. The legal and psychological consequences for Valerie were definitive. Faced with a mountain of evidence and a damning psychiatric evaluation that detailed her own history of abuse and her pathological projection onto Maya, she was found not guilty by reason of insanity. She was committed to a secure psychiatric facility, her name fading from their lives like a bad dream. Julian felt no triumph in this, only a profound, weary sadness for the cycle of pain and the two sisters his wife had lost, one to tragedy and one to madness. Maya was in therapy, working with a gentle, patient woman who used art to help her process what she couldn't say. Her drawings changed. The dark, looming shapes and angry brushes were gradually replaced by images of sunlight, of her and her father holding hands, of a dog they were planning to get. The colors grew brighter. One warm Saturday afternoon in late spring, they were in the garden, planting a new bed of flowers. Julian was showing her how to dig a hole for a small marigold plant. Maya, however, was more interested in the rich, dark soil itself. She began mixing it with water from the hose, creating a thick, glorious mud. She made mud pies, lining them up on the stone wall. She was covered in it, from her knees to her elbows, with a happy smudge across her cheek. For a brief second, as she looked up at him, a flicker of the old fear crossed her eyes. It was a subconscious reflex, the ghost of a voice telling her she was dirty, messy, wrong. Julian saw it. Without a word, he reached down, scooped up a dab of mud, and gently smeared it on his own nose. He crossed his eyes and grinned. "Looks like we're a couple of mud monsters," he said. Her face, tense for a fraction of a second, broke open into a radiant smile. And then she giggled. It wasn't the tentative bell-like sound from months ago. This was a deep, pure, uninhibited peal of joy, the sound of a child who knows, deep in her bones, that she is safe. She laughed until she had to hold her stomach, and Julian laughed with her, the sound echoing in the warm air of their garden. The curse was broken. The bad spots were finally gone, washed away not by bleach and brushes, but by laughter and love. That evening, they were curled up on the sofa, reading a book together. The house was quiet, filled with a peaceful, settled energy. Maya, sleepy and content, leaned her head against his chest. She was quiet for a long time, and Julian thought she had fallen asleep. Then, she spoke, her voice clear and strong against the fabric of his shirt. "I love you, Daddy." The word, the one he had longed to hear for so long, landed in his heart and healed a wound he didn't even know was still open. He held her tight, breathing in the scent of her shampoo and the faint, sweet smell of a day spent playing outside. His past failure wasn't erased, but it was redeemed. His purpose was no longer an abstract concept tied to stock prices and market share. It was real, and it was sleeping in his arms. We often build walls not of brick and mortar, but of grief and ambition, believing we are protecting ourselves, only to find we have imprisoned those we love most. Julian was able to tear down his wall, but how many children live behind facades of perfection, their quiet suffering unheard? What does it say about us, that we are so often willing to believe a perfect lie over a messy, inconvenient truth? The deepest scars aren't always the ones we can see. They are the silent wounds carried by those who are taught that they are not enough. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share a time when a small act of paying attention to a quiet child, a worried neighbor, or a friend in need made a world of difference. Your story matters, because it reminds us all to look past the perfect surfaces and truly see one another.